In the winter of 1943, a classified after-action report landed on the desk of General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, that should have shattered a decade of received wisdom. The report detailed the losses from the second Schweinfurt raid, October 14, 1943, a day that bomber crews would remember as Black Thursday. Of 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses that had departed England for the ball-bearing factories deep inside Germany, 60 had been shot down, 17 more had crashed or were scrapped upon return, and 121 required major repairs. More than 600 airmen were dead, wounded, or missing. The loss rate approached 20%, a figure that meant, statistically, no crew could expect to survive the 25-mission combat tour required for rotation home. Arnold read the numbers and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the central doctrinal pillar upon which the USAAF had staked its independence, its budgets, and its very reason for being was wrong. Question: why did the most technologically advanced Air Force in the world persist for nearly 2 years in a strategy that its own combat data proved was suicidal? How did a small group of true believers, the men who would become known as the Bomber Mafia, construct a theory of aerial warfare so elegant, so mathematically compelling, and so catastrophically detached from reality that it nearly destroyed the force it was designed to empower? To understand the magnitude of this doctrinal failure, one must return to the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama in the early 1930s. The men who gathered there, Harold George, Haywood Hansel, Robert Olds, and the younger Curtis LeMay, were not fools. They were intelligent, ambitious, and genuinely haunted by the slaughter of the Western Front. They had seen what industrialized ground warfare did to human bodies, and they were determined to find a way to make war shorter, more decisive, and less costly in lives. Their solution was radical in its simplicity. If air power could strike directly at the industrial heart of an enemy nation, the factories, the power plants, the transportation nodes that sustained armies in the field, then the grinding attrition of trench warfare could be bypassed entirely. The bomber would not support the army. The bomber would replace the army. This was not merely a tactical theory, it was a political argument. The Army Air Corps, subordinate to the ground forces and starved of budget by a navy that controlled long-range aviation, needed a mission that was exclusively its own. Strategic bombing provided that mission. If bombers could win wars independently, then the air arm deserved independence, its own service, equal status with the army and navy. The theory was seductive because it promised not just military efficiency, but institutional liberation. And like all seductive theories, it began to filter out evidence that contradicted it. The core tenet of what would become known as the Bomber Mafia was that heavily armed bomber formations, flying in tight combat boxes at high altitude during daylight, could defend themselves against enemy fighters without escort. The B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with up to 10 50 caliber machine guns, was the physical embodiment of this belief. The Norden bomb sight, a complex analog computer that supposedly allowed a bombardier to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, provided the precision that made the theory morally and operationally respectable. The Bomber Mafia was not simply arguing for air power. They were arguing for a particular kind of air power, discriminating, industrial, and above all, independent. Fighter escort was not merely unnecessary in this vision, it was ideologically suspect. If bombers needed fighters to survive, then air power was not independent. It was dependent, and dependence was the one thing the Bomber Mafia could not accept. The institutional mechanisms by which this doctrine suppressed dissent were subtle but effective. In 1941, General Ira Eaker, one of the most articulate spokesmen for the self-defending bomber theory, was sent to England for 6 weeks as a special air observer. The Royal Air Force, already 2 years into its own bombing campaign, had concluded that long-range fighter escort was not feasible. Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal wrote to Winston Churchill that increased range can only be provided at the expense of performance and maneuverability, and that the long-range fighter, whether built specifically as such, or whether given increased range by fitting extra tanks, will be at a disadvantage compared to the short-range high-performance fighter. Portal even told Eaker that the proper escort fighter will be a ship exactly like the bomber it is going to escort. The British had tried daylight bombing, suffered unsustainable losses, and switched to night area bombing under Arthur Harris. Their conclusion reinforced the American prejudice. Eaker returned to Washington with his convictions intact, and the USAAF entered the war with a doctrine that discounted the very possibility of long-range fighter escort. The problem was that this doctrine had been developed in the clear skies of training ranges against towed targets, in peacetime conditions that bore no resemblance to the combat environment over occupied Europe. The Bomber Mafia had tested their theory in optimal conditions, and by the beginning of the Second World War, their doctrine had become the primary air power strategy for the United States. What they had not tested was what happened when a formation of B-17s, however heavily armed, encountered a coordinated attack by German fighters firing cannon and rockets. Pressing home their assaults from angles the bombers' defensive guns could not cover, breaking off only to land, rearm, and attack again, wave after wave, for hours. The answer to that unasked question came on August 17, 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The 8th Air Force launched a dual strike, with 146 B-17s targeting the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, and 230 more hitting the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. The plan was complex, ambitious, and dependent on timing. The Regensburg force would fly on to North Africa after the attack, acting as a shuttle mission that would force German fighters to divide their attention. But weather delayed the Schweinfurt force by 3 hours. The Germans did not have to divide their attention. They could attack the Regensburg force, land, refuel, rearm, and be waiting for the Schweinfurt bombers when they arrived. Some P-47 Thunderbolts provided escort to the German border, but their range was insufficient to accompany the bombers to the targets. As the P-47s wagged their wings in farewell and turned for home, the Luftwaffe struck. The bombers fought their way to the targets, dropped their ordnance with impressive accuracy, and then fought their way back. But the cost was staggering. 60 bombers were lost, representing 20% of the attacking force. The 8th Air Force, already stretched thin, could not sustain such attrition. Deep penetration missions were suspended for months. The response of the bomber mafia's adherents to this disaster was not doctrinal reconsideration, but public relations. General Eaker pronounced that, "We now have our teeth in the Hun Air Force's neck," a statement that was, as one historian has noted, pure canard and wildly inaccurate. Privately, the leadership was deeply concerned, but publicly they maintained the fiction that the bombers had achieved a victory, that the losses were acceptable, that the doctrine remained sound. This was not merely stubbornness, it was existential necessity. The USAAF had promised that daylight precision bombing could win the war. It had staked its claim to post-war independence on that promise. To admit that the bombers could not survive without fighter escort was to admit that the Air Force was not, in fact, an independent strategic arm. It was to admit that the Navy and the Army had been right all along. The crisis deepened. In the week following Schweinfurt, the 8th Air Force launched a series of missions against targets in Germany that came to be known as Black Week. Between October 8 and October 14, 1943, over 1,000 bombers were dispatched against Bremen, Gdynia, Münster, and finally Schweinfurt again. The weather was atrocious. Cloud cover over England delayed formations, scattered groups, and prevented the bombers from assembling into their defensive combat boxes. By the time the surviving bombers reached Schweinfurt on October 14th, they were already depleted, disorganized, and alone. What followed was a 6-hour running battle that remains one of the most savage air engagements in history. German fighters attacked in waves, coming from the front where the bombers' defensive fire was weakest, diving vertically through the formations, dropping aerial bombs and rockets, then breaking away to let the next wave attack. The bomber gunners claimed 186 German fighters destroyed, a figure that was wildly inflated by multiple claims on the same aircraft and by the desperate psychology of men fighting for their lives. German records revealed actual losses of 31 fighters destroyed, 12 written off, and 34 damaged. The disparity between claimed and actual kills was itself a symptom of the doctrine's failure. The bomber mafia had convinced themselves that the bombers' defensive armament was sufficient. The gunners, trained in that faith, saw kills where there were only near misses. The reality was that 60 B-17s go down, 600 airmen were lost, and the 8th Air Force was effectively crippled. General Arnold, reading the after-action reports, understood that the USAAF had reached a strategic dead end. The theory of the self-defending bomber, elaborated in the lecture halls of Maxwell Field, refined in the briefing rooms of England, and sold to Congress and the American public as the path to victory, had been tested in combat and found wanting. The bombers could not defend themselves. The Norden bomb sight, for all its mechanical sophistication, could not compensate for the fact that aircraft shot out of the sky dropped no bombs. The doctrine that had promised to make war shorter and less bloody was consuming trained crews at a rate that exceeded America's ability to replace them. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, the bomber mafia's institutional grip remained powerful. Haywood Hansel, the master planner, who had done more than any other single officer to articulate the theory of precision bombing, remained committed to it. He would later write, in a memoir that is at once honest and self-exonerating, that the Schweinfurt raids should not have been undertaken until they could be prosecuted and sustained with sufficient force and within acceptable losses, and that they should have been delayed until long-range fighters were available to minimize the losses. But this was retrospective wisdom. At the time, Hansel and his colleagues had resisted the very development of long-range fighters, had dismissed the possibility as technologically infeasible, and had diverted resources and intellectual energy away from the escort mission that might have prevented the catastrophe. The neglect of long-range fighter development was not accidental, it was doctrinal. The Army Air Corps, influenced by budget constraints and the ascendancy of strategic bombardment theory, had simply stopped investing in the pursuit aviation that might have challenged the bomber's primacy. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which would become the first effective long-range escort, had been designed as an interceptor and ground attack aircraft, not as a bomber escort. The P-51 Mustang, which would ultimately solve the range problem, was a British-inspired marriage of an American airframe to a British engine, developed largely outside the US AAF's doctrinal priorities. The drop tanks that extended fighter range were available in principle, but were not prioritized because the leadership did not believe they were necessary. The bomber mafia had constructed a closed intellectual system in which the bomber was supreme, the fighter was marginal, and the evidence of combat was filtered through a lens that preserved the theory at the expense of the pilots. The irony of this doctrinal rigidity is that the very institution the bomber mafia sought to liberate was saved by the kind of tactical aviation they had spent a decade dismissing. In January 1944, with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in significant numbers, the 8th Air Force finally possessed a fighter that could accompany the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang did not merely protect the bombers. It actively sought out and destroyed the Luftwaffe's fighter force, achieving kill ratios that approached 10-to-1 in the final year of the war. The P-47, fitted with drop tanks and refined with paddle blade propellers, performed similar service, particularly in the critical months before the Mustang arrived in force. The fighters did not merely enable the bombing campaign, they reversed its strategic logic. Where the bomber mafia had argued that bombers could win wars independently, the fighters won the war by destroying the Luftwaffe, thereby making the bombing campaign possible. This reversal was not acknowledged by the bomber mafia's adherents. The official histories, written largely by men trained in the strategic bombing tradition, credited the B-17 and the B-24 with victory. The fighters were mentioned, but as auxiliaries, as supporting elements in a bomber-centric narrative. The reality was precisely the opposite. The strategic bombing offensive did not defeat the Luftwaffe. The fighters defeated the Luftwaffe, and the strategic bombing offensive survived because of that defeat. The Big Week of February 1944, often cited as the turning point when Allied bombing finally broke German fighter production, was in fact a series of massive fighter sweeps and bomber escort missions that forced the Germans into an attritional battle they could not win. The bombers destroyed factories, yes, but the fighters destroyed the pilots and the aircraft that defended those factories. Without the fighters, the bombers would have continued to suffer Schweinfurt-level losses until the 8th Air Force ceased to exist. The doctrinal conflict between bomber and fighter advocates was not merely an intellectual dispute. It had direct, lethal consequences for the men who flew the missions. The bomber crews who went to Schweinfurt in October 1943 were the victims of a theory that had been protected from reality by institutional arrogance. They had been told that their aircraft were flying fortresses, that their defensive armament was sufficient, that the Norden bomb site made them the most lethal weapon in the world. They believed these things because their leaders believed them, and their leaders believed them because to doubt them was to doubt the Air Force's claim to independent status. The crews paid for that institutional vanity with their lives. The fighter pilots who saved the bombing campaign were, in many cases, the same men who had been dismissed by the bomber mafia as tactical auxiliaries. They were not strategic thinkers. They were not doctrinal innovators. They were men like Hubert Zemke and the 56th Fighter Group, who developed the Zemke-Fan to sweep the skies ahead of the bomber streams. They were men like Jimmy Thech in the Pacific, who proved that teamwork and geometry could defeat individual brilliance. They were the anonymous P-51 pilots who flew 8-hour missions in sub-zero cockpits, their fuel gauges ticking toward empty, to ensure that the bombers they escorted had a formation to return to. They did not win the war by destroying factories. They won it by making it possible for the factories to be destroyed. The post-war settlement of this doctrinal dispute was predictably self-serving. The United States Air Force, established as an independent service in 1947, built its institutional identity around strategic bombing. The Strategic Air Command, with its fleets of nuclear-armed bombers, was the bomber mafia's ultimate vindication, at least in organizational terms. The fighters were relegated to tactical air commands, to air defense roles, to the close air support missions that the bomber barons had always considered beneath the dignity of independent air power. The doctrine that had nearly lost the war in 1943 became the doctrine that defined American military strategy for half a century. But the truth of 1943 could not be entirely suppressed. Every bomber crewman who survived Schweinfurt because a P-51 appeared out of nowhere to drive off an attacking Bf-109 knew the truth. Every fighter pilot who watched a B-17 formation disintegrate under fighter attack, despite its 10 machine guns and its combat box, knew the truth. The bomber was not a fortress. It was a weapon platform, vulnerable and dependent, requiring air superiority before it could perform its function. And air superiority could only be won by fighters. The bomber mafia's legacy is thus more complex than either their admirers or their critics acknowledge. They were not villains. They were men who genuinely believed they had found a way to make war less terrible, who believed that precision bombing could collapse an enemy's capacity to resist without the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, who believed that air power could break the cycle of industrialized ground warfare that had consumed a generation in 1914. Haywood Hansell, in particular, was a man of genuine moral conviction who argued that we may find the Air Force charged with breaking the will to resist of the enemy nation. Let us make it emphatically clear that that does not mean the indiscriminate bombing of women and children. His replacement by Curtis LeMay in the Pacific and LeMay's subsequent shift to low-altitude incendiary bombing represented not the triumph of the bomber mafia, but its defeat by operational reality. Yet the bomber mafia's blindness to the necessity of fighter escort, their dismissal of pursuit aviation, their institutional suppression of any doctrine that challenged bomber supremacy nearly cost the Allies the air war in Europe. They built a theory so elegant, so intellectually coherent, so politically necessary that it became immune to the evidence of combat. They promised that bombers could win wars independently, and they were wrong. The wars were won by the combined arms of bombers and fighters, with the fighters establishing the conditions without which the bombers could not survive. The final lesson of the bomber mafia is about the danger of doctrinal purity. When a theory becomes inseparable from an institution's identity, when questioning the theory is treated as treason against the institution, then the institution loses its capacity to learn. The USAF nearly lost the European Air War, not because it lacked courage, technology, or industrial capacity, but because it lacked the intellectual humility to admit that its founding doctrine was flawed. The fighter pilots who saved the strategic bombing campaign did so not because they were better theorists, but because they were better empiricists. They looked at the sky, saw what was actually happening, and adapted. The bomber mafia looked at the sky, saw what their doctrine predicted, and insisted that reality was wrong. By the spring of 1944, when the P-51 Mustang finally arrived in numbers sufficient to escort the bombers to Berlin and back, the air war over Europe had already been decided. Not by the bombers, and not by the precision that the Norden bomb site had promised. It had been decided by the fighters, the P-47s and P-51s and P-38s, who had proven that air superiority was not a luxury for strategic bombing, but a prerequisite. The bomber mafia had spent a decade arguing that the bomber would always get through. The fighters proved that the bomber would only get through if the fighters cleared the way first. The fighters proved that the bomber would only get through if the fighters cleared the way first. And in that proof lies the true history of how the air war was won. Not by the elegant theory of strategic bombardment, but by the brute, empirical, life-saving reality that no bomber, however heavily armed, however precisely sighted, however philosophically compelling, could survive in contested skies without the fighters that the bomber mafia had spent a decade trying to render obsolete.